Helen Matthews had spent 15 years working at a company that felt like a second home. Every morning, she walked into her office with the same determination she had when she first started. With her husband Michael and their daughter Emily, now away at university, life had fallen into a rhythm. Predictable, even comforting. That was until everything collapsed almost overnight. Helen's world shifted the day the company's management announced they were downsizing. They told her she was being let go, not because of her performance, but because the business needed to cut costs. As she packed up her desk, memories of years of dedication flashed before her eyes. She had worked hard, even sacrificed time with her family, believing her job provided security. Now it was all gone, and for the first time in years, she faced a future without a clear path. Returning home that evening, hoping for some comfort, she was met with even more devastating news. Michael, the man she had built her life with, confessed that he had fallen in love with someone else. "I've met someone, Helen," he said quietly, as if trying to soften the blow. But nothing could soften the pain. Every word felt like a hammer, shattering the life they had carefully constructed over the years. He wanted a divorce, leaving Helen with a broken heart and a home filled with reminders of what once was. To make matters worse, Emily, her bright, ambitious daughter, was drifting further away. She was busy exploring her own independence at university and seemed less interested in the troubles at home. Helen couldn't blame her. She wanted Emily to succeed, to find her own way, but the loneliness was sharp. The silence of the house was unbearable. A few weeks later, after the dust of the divorce had settled and the paperwork was signed, Helen made a decision she never thought she'd have the courage to make. She sold the house, packed up her remaining belongings, and left the town she had known all her life. The memories, now bitter, were too heavy to carry. She moved to Brighton, a place she had visited once, many years ago, on a rare family vacation. The town by the sea had seemed peaceful, full of promise. Now, she needed that peace more than ever. The first days in Brighton were unsettling. The salty air, the calls of seagulls, and the rolling waves of the sea felt foreign compared to the familiar, landlocked streets of her old hometown. She rented a small apartment, modest but cozy, with a view of the ocean just beyond the rooftops. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and for the first time in months, Helen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was where she could rebuild. In the early days of her new life, she found solace in the little bookstore at the corner of her street. It was a quiet place, stacked floor to ceiling with novels, poetry, and old, dusty classics. Helen spent hours there, wandering between the shelves, losing herself in stories far from her own. One afternoon, while browsing a section on self-discovery, she met Anna, the store's only other employee. Anna was a woman in her 30s with an easy smile and a quick wit. "New in town, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Helen nodded, unsure if she was ready to share her story with a stranger. "Well, you've come to the right place," Anna said, glancing around the bookstore. "There's nothing like getting lost in a book when life feels a bit messy." That comment, simple and understanding, was exactly what Helen needed to hear. Slowly, over the next few weeks, the two women became friends. They had lunch together on their breaks, talked about books, and occasionally ventured into deeper, more personal conversations. Anna's presence was a comfort, a reminder that even in a strange city, you could find people who understood you without needing all the details. Helen had a job at the bookstore now, and while it didn't pay much, it filled her days with purpose. She enjoyed recommending books to customers, chatting about their favorite authors, and even organizing the occasional literary event. It was at one of these events, on a cloudy afternoon, that Helen's life took another unexpected turn. After a particularly lively book discussion, she decided to stop by a small seaside cafe for a cup of coffee. It was there, sitting by the window, that she met James. He owned the cafe, a quiet, unassuming man with a kind face and warm, brown eyes. They exchanged a few polite words, but nothing more. Yet, from that moment, something shifted in Helen. She didn't know it yet, but life in Brighton had just begun to open up in ways she couldn't have imagined. In the quiet of her new apartment, as the sun set over the sea, Helen thought back to the woman she had been just months ago. She had lost everything she thought she needed: her career, her husband, and even the closeness with her daughter. But as she stared out at the vast ocean, its waves crashing endlessly against the shore, she realized something profound. Sometimes, losing everything is just the beginning of finding yourself. The wind picked up outside, carrying with it the scent of salt and the promise of new possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Helen allowed herself to believe in a future where she might find happiness again. The first part of Helen's journey was far from over. Brighton, with its strange mix of beauty and sadness, held many more twists and turns. But for now, as she stood on the precipice of her new life, she felt a spark of hope. And that was enough. Helen adjusted to life in Brighton more quickly than she had expected. The early mornings walking along the pebble-strewn beach, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from nearby cafes, and the soft murmurs of strangers chatting at the local market became a comforting routine. It was a new rhythm, one slower, simpler, but filled with a strange kind of peace. Her days at the bookstore were steady, predictable. She'd fallen into the habit of opening the shop in the mornings, tidying the shelves, and chatting with Anna, whose warm energy was infectious. They talked about everything: books, life in Brighton, and slowly, over time, Helen began to open up about her own struggles. "You know," Anna said one afternoon as they were rearranging a display, "starting over is terrifying, but also liberating." She shot Helen a knowing look, as if she understood the weight she was carrying. Helen smiled softly. "It doesn't feel liberating yet. It just feels uncertain." Anna nodded. "Give it time. I've been where you are, and trust me, the uncertainty eventually turns into possibility." That idea lingered in Helen's mind for days. Perhaps this uncertainty wasn't just something to survive. It might lead her somewhere new, somewhere better. It was during one of her evening walks along the beach that she saw James again. He was leaning against the railing by the pier, sipping a coffee and watching the waves roll in. Helen hadn't expected to see him there, but when he glanced up and smiled, something inside her shifted. "Care for a coffee?" he asked, nodding toward his cafe just down the street. Helen hesitated, her instinct to keep her distance still strong. But something about James felt safe, unthreatening. She nodded. "Sure." They walked to his cafe together, and as they settled into a small corner booth, Helen noticed how easy it was to be around him. There were no expectations, no hidden motives. James was simply kind, a man who had also known loss, and that shared understanding created an unspoken bond between them. "So, what brought you to Brighton?" James asked, his voice low and gentle. Helen stared into her coffee, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to seem fragile or pitiful, but after a long moment, she decided to be honest. "A fresh start. I lost my job, my marriage ended. I just needed to get away from everything." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. Sometimes leaving is the only way to breathe again." Helen looked up, surprised at how perfectly he understood. "You too." "Yeah," he said, leaning back. "I lost my business last year, right before the divorce. It was like everything fell apart at once. I moved here because I needed space to figure out who I was again." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Helen felt a flicker of something that resembled connection, maybe even hope. She wasn't alone in this experience of loss and rebuilding. They were two people trying to find their way back to themselves. Over the next few weeks, James became a regular presence in Helen's life. Sometimes they met for coffee. Other times he'd stop by the bookstore and browse the shelves, making light conversation. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. It was simply friendship, but one built on a deep understanding of the pain they'd both endured. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the sea, James shared more about his past. He talked about how his cafe had been his dream, something he'd poured all of his energy into, only to see it fail when the economy took a downer. The divorce had come shortly after, leaving him with a deep sense of failure. "But you didn't give up," Helen said quietly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You started again." "I had to," James replied. "What else could I do? Life doesn't stop because things fall apart. You just have to keep going." Helen let his words settle over her. They resonated deeply. She had been keeping herself going, but for the first time, she wondered if maybe it was time to do more than just survive. Maybe it was time to start truly living again. As winter settled over Brighton, the days grew shorter and colder, but Helen felt something in her warming. The heaviness she had carried for so long, the weight of losing her job, her marriage, and the life she had known, began to lift, if only slightly. But life, as it often does, had more challenges in store. One rainy afternoon, just as she was closing up the bookstore, Helen received a message that sent a chill through her. It was from Emily, her daughter, whom she hadn't heard much from in weeks. "Mom, can we talk? I've been thinking about Dad. I've decided I want to see him again." Helen's heart dropped. Michael, just when she thought she was beginning to leave the past behind, there he was, finding his way back into her life through Emily. She sat down at her desk, staring at the message, unsure how to respond. Part of her knew Emily was an adult now, with the right to make her own decisions, but the thought of Michael worming his way back into their lives, after everything he had done, filled Helen with dread. That evening, Helen called Emily. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with small talk about university, classes, and friends, but eventually Emily brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. "I've been talking to Dad," Emily said, her voice quiet. "I know it's hard for you to hear, but I miss him. I want to rebuild my relationship with him." Helen felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say no, to protect Emily from the man who had caused so much pain, but she knew that wouldn't be fair. Emily needed to make her own choices. "Just be careful," Helen said softly. "I don't want you to get hurt." "I won't, Mom. I'll be okay." After they hung up, Helen sat in the quiet of her apartment, the familiar loneliness creeping back in. It seemed the past, no matter how hard she tried to outrun it, was always waiting just around the corner. And if that wasn't enough, a week later, Helen's lawyer called. Michael had filed a claim for part of the property they once owned together, demanding his share. It was a low blow, but one that forced Helen to face him again, just as she was starting to heal. As the new year approached, Helen found herself standing at the edge of a new battle. She had thought the worst was behind her, but now it seemed the past wasn't quite finished with her yet. The fight for her future, her freedom, was just beginning. Helen looked out at the stormy sea, the wind whipping her hair across her face. This time, she wasn't going to let Michael break her. She had come too far, and there was too much at stake. Her new life, her friendships, and perhaps, just perhaps, the flicker of something more with James. The next chapter of her life was full of uncertainty, but as she stood on that cliff, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, Helen knew one thing. She was stronger than she had ever realized. The fight for her future had begun, and this time, she was ready. The winter winds howled through the streets of Brighton, and Helen found herself bracing for more than just the cold. She had spent the last few months finding some semblance of peace, but life had a way of pulling her back into its complexities. Her daughter, Emily, was reconnecting with Michael, and now her ex-husband was demanding a share of their old property. It felt like a storm was brewing, one that threatened to tear apart the delicate new life Helen had begun to build. The letter from Michael's lawyer arrived on a particularly gray morning. Helen stared at it for a long time before opening it, the weight of its contents heavy even before she read a single word. Inside, the formal language was clear. Michael was claiming part of the house they had once shared, the house Helen had sold to fund her move to Brighton. He wanted a share of the profits, despite the fact that their divorce had seemed settled months ago. Helen's heart raced as she read the letter again and again. The sheer audacity of his claim left her breathless with anger. He had already taken enough from her. Her marriage, her sense of security, even the closeness with Emily. And now he wanted more? After a long, sleepless night, Helen decided to seek advice. She made an appointment with a lawyer in Brighton, a woman named Sarah who had been recommended by Anna. Sarah was direct but compassionate as she listened to Helen's story. "You have options," Sarah said after carefully reviewing the documents. "Michael's claim is weak, but it could drag on if he's determined. You'll need to decide how far you're willing to fight." Helen stared at the papers, feeling both tired and resolute. "I'll fight," she said, the words escaping her mouth before she could second-guess herself. "I'm not letting him take anything more from me." The next few weeks were filled with legal back and forth, but through it all, Helen tried to maintain her daily routines. Work at the bookstore became her refuge, and Anna's friendship grew deeper, becoming a source of strength. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, but in those moments, Helen reminded herself that she had already survived so much. She wasn't going to break now. James, too, remained a steady presence in her life. He had become more than just a friend, though Helen hadn't yet admitted that to herself. Their connection deepened as they shared quiet conversations over coffee and long walks by the sea. But despite the warmth she felt when she was with him, Helen couldn't shake the fear that opening her heart again would only lead to more pain. Her wounds from Michael were still too fresh, too raw. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of legal battles, Helen found herself at James's cafe. The air inside was warm and smelled of cinnamon and coffee, a sharp contrast to the icy wind outside. James was behind the counter, his easy smile making her feel instantly at ease. "You look like you've had a rough day," he said, pouring her a cup of tea without asking. Helen sighed, sinking into the chair by the window. "You have no idea. Want to talk about it?" For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but something in James's quiet, patient gaze made her want to open up. She told him about Michael's claim, the stress of the legal fight, and the painful distance that seemed to be growing between her and Emily. "I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove something," she admitted. "Like I have to defend the life I'm building here, but I'm always waiting for someone or something to tear it apart." James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Helen, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. That's enough." His words sank in, and for a moment, Helen felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, needed someone to remind her of her strength. As the evening wore on, their conversation turned lighter, and Helen found herself laughing for the first time in days. It was easy with James, effortless in a way that made her both comforted and uneasy at the same time. As they locked up the cafe and stepped outside into the brisk night air, James walked her back to her apartment, their footsteps crunching softly in the fresh layer of snow. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him before they reached her door. "For tonight. For everything." James smiled, a soft warmth in his eyes. "Anytime, Helen. Really." They stood there for a moment, the cold air swirling around them, and for a brief second, Helen considered closing the distance between them, stepping into his arms. But just as quickly, the moment passed. She wasn't ready. Not yet. "Good night, James," she said softly, stepping inside and gently closing the door behind her. The weeks blurred together, the legal battle with Michael dragging on longer than Helen had hoped. It took a toll on her, both financially and emotionally, but she refused to give up. She spent more time with Emily, trying to understand her daughter's need to reconnect with her father, even as it pained her. Emily, though kind, was firm in her decision, and while Helen didn't agree with it, she knew she couldn't stop her from seeking a relationship with Michael. Still, it stung every time Emily mentioned him. One day, after receiving yet another frustrating update from her lawyer, Helen found herself feeling overwhelmed. She closed the bookstore early and walked along the beach, letting the wind and the sound of crashing waves drown out her thoughts. She felt lost again, as if the progress she'd made in Brighton was slipping away. Just then, her phone rang. It was Sarah, her lawyer. "Helen, I've got some news," Sarah said, her voice calm but with a hint of triumph. "We've reached a settlement. Michael's backing down. He's agreed to take a much smaller share. It's over." Helen stood frozen on the beach, the words sinking in. After months of fighting, months of stress, it was finally over. She could feel the tension leaving her body, a wave of relief washing over her. "Thank you, Sarah," Helen whispered, tears prickling the corners of her eyes. "Thank you." That night, Helen sat on her balcony, watching the sun set over the ocean. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to feel truly free. The fight was over. She had stood her ground, defended her new life, and won. But more than that, she realized that she had grown stronger through it all. As the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Helen thought about James, about the friendship that had blossomed into something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to name. But now, with the legal battle behind her, she felt a small flicker of possibility. Maybe it was time to open her heart again. The tide had turned in her favor, and for the first time in a long time, Helen allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, brighter days lay ahead. The storm had passed, but the journey wasn't over. Helen knew there were still uncertainties, still challenges to face. But she also knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her strength, and now she was ready to embrace the future with open arms. Spring arrived in Brighton with a quiet beauty. The once bare branches were now filled with buds, and the salty air carried a hint of warmth. Helen felt as though the world around her was slowly coming back to life, much like she was. The weight of her legal battle with Michael had finally lifted, leaving her with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. But with that freedom came the realization that her life was moving forward in ways she hadn't anticipated, and there were choices she needed to make. Emily had been visiting more often since the settlement. Though their relationship had been strained by Michael's return, Helen could feel the distance between them narrowing, if only slightly. Emily was no longer the little girl who had once needed her for everything. She was now an independent young woman, finding her own way in the world. Helen was proud of her, but the growing independence left a bittersweet taste. It reminded Helen of how much things had changed. One Saturday morning, as they sat together in the cafe where James worked, Emily finally broached the topic Helen had been avoiding. "So I met Dad's new wife," Emily said, her voice casual but tinged with something Helen couldn't quite place. "Her name is Clara." The mention of Michael and his new wife felt like a punch to Helen's gut, though she tried not to let it show. She stirred her coffee, forcing herself to breathe through the flood of emotions that rose within her. She had known this day would come. Emily had every right to meet Clara, but it didn't make it any easier. "Oh," Helen said, her voice steady but soft. "How did it go?" Emily sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It was weird. She's nice enough, I guess. But it felt strange, you know? I mean, seeing Dad with someone else. It's not like I expected them to stay apart forever, but it just, I don't know. It made everything feel more real." Helen nodded, understanding exactly what her daughter meant. She had gone through her own grieving process when Michael had left, but for Emily, the reality of their family's fracture was only now becoming clear. "I'm sorry it's hard for you, Em," Helen said gently. "But I'm glad you told me." Emily looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "It's not just that. I've been thinking a lot about you, too." Helen raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" "I've watched you rebuild everything," Emily continued, her voice growing softer. "You've been through so much, but you've kept going. And I think, in a way, I never realized how strong you are. I guess I was angry with you when everything first happened, but now I see things differently." Helen blinked, taken aback by her daughter's words. She had been waiting for this conversation, but she hadn't expected it to happen over a quiet cup of coffee on a spring morning. Her heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of pride and relief. "I'm glad you can see that now," Helen said softly. "I've missed you, Emily. I know we've been distant, but I've always wanted what's best for you." Emily reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "I know, Mom, and I want you to be happy too. I've noticed that you and James seem close." Helen felt her cheeks flush, and she let out a nervous laugh. "James is a good friend." Emily gave her a knowing smile. "A good friend, huh? Is that all he is?" Helen didn't answer right away, but she couldn't deny the truth anymore. Not to herself and not to Emily. "It's complicated," she admitted. "I care about him, but after everything that happened with your dad, I'm not sure I'm ready to jump into something new." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I get that, but you deserve to be happy, Mom. Don't let what happened with Dad hold you back from finding that." The words hung in the air, and Helen felt their weight. Emily had always been wise beyond her years, but this was different. It was as if, for the first time, they were seeing each other as equals. Both women navigating the complexities of life and love. Later that evening, Helen found herself at the bookstore, alone after closing. She had needed the quiet, the familiar comfort of the shelves, to think about everything Emily had said. Her daughter was right. She couldn't let the past dictate her future forever. As she thumbed through a stack of books, the door to the shop creaked open, and Helen looked up to see James standing in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Hey," he said softly, stepping inside. "I know it's late, but I saw the lights on and thought you might still be here." Helen smiled, her heart warming at the sight of him. "I was just thinking." James stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Anything you want to talk about?" Helen hesitated, feeling the familiar pull between them. She had spent so long guarding her heart, but now, standing here in the quiet of the bookstore, she felt an undeniable urge to let James in. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of happiness. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Helen said finally, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "And how much you've been there for me these past few months." James looked at her, his expression serious but kind. "I care about you, Helen. You know that." "I know," she said quietly. "And I care about you too. But I've been scared of what could happen if I let myself feel something again." James reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "It's okay to be scared, but we don't have to rush anything. We can just take it slow, see where this goes." Helen felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. Maybe it didn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe they could figure this out together. "Okay," she said, nodding. "Let's take it slow." James smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Helen felt a flicker of hope, a quiet, steady feeling that maybe, just maybe, her heart was ready to heal. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet moments and subtle changes. Helen and James continued to spend time together, but now there was an openness between them that hadn't been there before. They didn't talk about the future. Instead, they focused on the present, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. One Saturday morning, as they walked along the beach, Helen felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't known was possible. The sea stretched out endlessly before them, the waves lapping gently at the shore. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. She was simply here, in this moment, with James by her side. They stopped at the edge of the pier, watching the gulls wheel overhead, and James turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Helen," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking. There's this old space by the sea, an art studio that's been closed for years. I've been toying with the idea of turning it into something new, something like a cafe and art gallery, a place where people can come together. And I was wondering, would you want to be a part of it?" Helen looked at him, surprised but intrigued. "A cafe and art gallery?" "Yeah," James said, his eyes lighting up. "You love books, I love coffee. And there's space for literary events, art shows, things like that. I think we could make it work." Helen felt her heart skip a beat. The idea of creating something new, something beautiful, with James was both exciting and terrifying. But as she stood there, Looking out at the sea and feeling the warmth of James's hand in hers, she realized that maybe this was what she had been waiting for, a chance to build something that was truly her own. "I'd love that," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Together, they stood at the edge of the pier, the future unfolding before them like the endless horizon. It wasn't perfect, and there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Helen felt ready to face whatever came next. Because she wasn't doing it alone. The space James had found near the sea was perfect, a sun-drenched old building with large windows that overlooked the shoreline. The moment Helen stepped inside, she could see the potential. High ceilings, exposed brick walls, and plenty of room for shelves, tables, and art. It felt like the start of something beautiful, and for the first time, Helen could see herself building a future here, one that wasn't tied to her past, but rooted in the present. Over the next few months, Helen and James worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They called the space the Seaside Haven, a cafe and art gallery that celebrated creativity, community, and the power of stories. James handled the coffee and cafe side, while Helen curated the books, organized literary events, and worked with local artists to showcase their work. It was a labor of love, and the process of creating something from the ground up filled Helen with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The opening day arrived on a bright summer morning. The cafe was abuzz with energy as locals poured in to see the new space, sipping coffee and browsing the bookshelves. The walls were adorned with art from local painters and photographers, and Helen had set up a small corner for readings and discussions. The space felt alive, filled with the warmth of new beginnings. Helen stood behind the counter, watching as people wandered through the cafe, chatting with James and admiring the art. She felt a swell of pride as she took it all in. This was hers, something she had helped create, something that felt like a reflection of the new life she was building. Emily arrived late in the morning, smiling brightly as she hugged her mother. "It's amazing, Mom. I can't believe how beautiful it all turned out." Helen beamed. "It was a lot of work, but it was worth every minute. I'm so glad you're here to see it." Emily looked around, her eyes lingering on the cafe's cozy atmosphere. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Helen asked, curious. "I've decided to move back to Brighton after I graduate," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with excitement. "I want to be closer to you. And, well, I love this place. I could help out here too if you'd like." Helen's heart skipped a beat, a wave of joy washing over her. "Emily, I would love that. You have no idea how much it would mean to me to have you here." Emily smiled softly. "It feels like the right place to be. I've been thinking a lot about the past year, about everything we've been through, and I realize now that I want to be closer to my family, especially you." Helen hugged her tightly, her heart full. It had been a long, hard road, but she and Emily were finally finding their way back to each other. Later that afternoon, as the day wound down and the cafe grew quieter, Helen found a moment to step outside. She walked down to the beach, letting the cool sand slip between her toes as she wandered along the shore. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the water, and Helen felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The heartbreak of losing her job, the collapse of her marriage, the distance that had grown between her and Emily. It had all seemed unbearable at the time. But now, standing here by the sea, she realized that each painful moment had been part of her journey towards something new, something better. As she gazed out at the horizon, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw James approaching, his hands tucked into his pockets, a gentle smile on his face. "Taking a break?" he asked, joining her by the water's edge. Helen nodded, smiling softly. "Just needed a moment to take it all in." James stood beside her, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. After a few moments, he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. He said quietly, "I've been thinking about how much things have changed for both of us. When I first moved here, I didn't think I'd ever feel happy again. And now I can't imagine my life without this place. Without you. Helen felt her heart skip a beat, warmth flooding her chest. She had spent so long protecting herself from the possibility of being hurt again. But in this moment, standing here with James, she realized she was ready. Ready to let go of the fear. Ready to embrace the love that had been growing between them. I feel the same, she said, her voice soft but sure. I didn't expect any of this, least of all you. But now, I can't imagine my life without you either. James smiled, reaching out to take her hand. They stood there together, watching the waves roll in, the world around them quiet and still. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt completely at peace. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. The seaside haven flourished, becoming a beloved spot in Brighton, where people gathered to enjoy good coffee, great books, and inspiring art. Helen continued to host literary evenings, bringing the community together through storytelling and shared experiences. She had found her passion again, not just in books, but in the connection she built with the people around her. Emily graduated and moved back to Brighton, true to her word. She became a vital part of the cafe, bringing fresh ideas and youthful energy to the space. The mother-daughter bond that had once felt fragile now grew stronger with each passing day, and Helen was grateful for the second chance they had been given. And then there was James. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, but with a depth and sincerity that Helen had never known before. He was patient with her, understanding of her past and the fears she still carried, but he also made her feel safe, loved, and worthy of happiness. One evening, as they closed up the cafe after a long day, James turned to her, his expression serious but full of warmth. "Helen," he said softly, "there's something I want to ask you." Helen looked up at him, her heart fluttering in her chest. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, then smiled. "I love you, and I want to build a future with you. Not just here with the cafe, but in every part of our lives. Will you stay with me for the long haul?" Helen's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. She nodded, unable to find the words. Instead, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him, holding him close. "Yes," she whispered into his shoulder. "Yes, I'll stay." Helen Matthews had come to Brighton with nothing but the hope of escaping her pain. But she had found so much more than she ever imagined. She had found friendship, love, and most importantly, herself. The woman who had once felt broken and lost had become someone new, someone strong, resilient, and full of hope for the future. As the sun set over the sea, casting the world in a soft, golden glow, Helen stood in front of the cafe she had helped build, the man she loved by her side, her daughter nearby. The past was behind her, and the future was full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Helen felt truly, deeply happy.